Hi students, thank you for joining me today. Today we're going to be talking about chapter 12 in our textbook, which is the developmental behavioral approach. So this is behavioral modification, positive reinforcement, natural logical consequences, etc. So we're going to go ahead and dive into our objectives for this chapter. So after reading this chapter, you should be able to provide examples of changes in children's behavior that are a result of teachers learning how to blend both developmental and behavioral principles, define a behavioral approach to early intervention, including use of reinforcement, describe the difference between discipline and punishment, explain step-by-step learning and the use of task analysis and how they are important when working with children in general and with children with developmental problems in particular. And finally, provide examples of learning by imitation and explain its significance in early childhood education. So before you go on, I just want to make sure that we are practicing information processing, which is read the objective first, and then what? Do you remember? So read the objective first before diving into the chapter text. Think about what you already know. That way you're activating your prior knowledge. You're illuminating your schema. You are thinking about what you already know or what you think you know about these topics before moving on. And then as you go through the chapter, you are elaborating, gaining new information, clarifying misconceptions, adding on to that schema, and building new knowledge. And this will help you move your information from this chapter, from your short-term memory into your working and long-term memory, which means you've actually learned the material. It will be there in your mind to be able to be retrieved later when you need it. All right. So once you've read the objectives, you've thought about what you know about them, you are able to move on to the next part. Okay. So developmental and behavioral principles, a blend. So there are two kind of schools of thought, the historical influences behind these developmental and behavioral approaches. The first is the maturationists. That comes from the maturational theory. These folks believe that development is independent of experience. So in other words, you're born with this intrinsic, inherent way of developing, and it doesn't matter your environment, doesn't matter outside influences. So it's kind of like, the nature versus nurture debate. This would be more the nature. So you're born with this developmental progression, and it doesn't matter so much what kind of environmental influences you get. Then we also have the constructivists, and they say that this is not entirely true. So not entirely in agreement with maturationists, not completely opposed, but not completely in agreement either. So the constructivist believes that there needs to be a match between developmental level and experience. So if you think about developmentally appropriate practices and making sure that you are aligning a child's developmental level with the types of experiences that they're getting. And continuing this idea, there is the problem of the match, what we call. So this is providing materials for children at the right time and the right way can be a concern for teachers. So in other words, the inability or the challenges with being able to do that is an area that educators feel is problematic. If you don't have the right or developmentally appropriate resources for children, then there can be a problem. So there's a mismatch. Material should lead to rewarding experiences, and children should feel proud that they did it themselves. So in other words, you probably wouldn't give a 6-month-old a Rubik's Cube to solve because, number one, they don't have the fine motor skills to be able to manipulate it, but just the level of critical thinking and visual acuity that they need to be able to solve it, they would most likely be unsuccessful. So thinking about giving children opportunities to be successful with the tools that they get. And we'll talk about this a little bit later. You probably are thinking about Vygotsky's ZPD, Zone of Proximal Development. You may have recalled that from Child Development 1. So we'll talk about that a little bit later in this chapter. I'm going to go back. There's one other little point I wanted to mention. This last statement, children should feel proud that they did it themselves. You'll notice as children start to get older, around 2-3 years old, and that sort of independent self emerges, it's very important that you give little ones an opportunity to struggle. And these are both typical children and children with disabilities, although obviously you need to meet children with special needs where they are developmentally, not necessarily their chronicle age, but their developmental age. But you want to make sure that you give children an opportunity to tackle something, whether it's opening a bottle or stacking a block, etc. You want to give them an opportunity to try it themselves. There's a saying, I can't remember it exactly, that I read, but it was something like, the more you ask me if I need help, the less I think you believe I can do it. So in other words, if you're constantly intervening and asking a child if they need help, or even jumping in to help them before they've even asked, then that can inadvertently send a message to the child that maybe I can't do this, maybe I'm not capable, maybe I don't have the ability to do that. And so it can lower their self-efficacy, and it can prevent them from trying to challenge themselves to try to do things independently. So I just wanted to make that point before moving on. All right, so continuing with developmental and behavioral principles, a blend. So learning from success. Teachers break down learning into small steps and reward the success of mastering the little steps. So positive reinforcement for those incremental milestones can be very important. Children then are motivated to learn more. And I would venture to say not just children. I think as adults too, when we are tackling new and challenging things, it's nice to be given positive reinforcement as we tackle the small milestones and those small victories. So here you might be familiar with Vygotsky's constructivist approach. This gives you a visual breakdown of scaffolding. So we have the zone of proximal development. So you see the bottom block is guidance. That's the type of intervention or guidance that you're giving to the child. And then as we move up, we see scaffolding. That's the assistance that the adult gives so that the child can meet higher achievement. So I like to say the ZPD is that sweet spot. So in between where things are too challenging for a child, where they're going to maybe shut down because it's just too difficult. Think about that 6-month-old with Rubik's Cube, and the child that is being given tasks that are below where they are developmentally, too easy, and so they're not being challenged and they're not given an opportunity to learn, to grow, and move on to the next level. So the zone of proximal development is that zone where, with just a little bit of help, little bit of support and guidance from a peer or a caregiver, a grown-up, then that child is able to meet the next level. So now we're going to discuss environmental arrangements. A prepared learning environment is matched to each child's current skill level. So again, it's not necessarily related to age, especially when we discuss exceptional children. We're talking about specifically their skill levels. Materials and activities sequenced in small enough segments to provide both success and challenge. So again, tying back to ZPD. Emphasis on learning through play and active involvement with appropriate materials, and responsive teachers who serve as guides and facilitators rather than instructors. So you may have heard this saying, teacher should be a guide on the side rather than a sage on the stage. So the teacher should be alongside the students, learning with them and helping facilitate their learning versus standing in the front of the room at all times and, the omniscient person telling the children exactly what they should be doing. It should be a mutual exchange where the teacher is alongside the students and guiding them along their learning journey. Behavior principles and practices. So thinking about this statement, every child can learn. Excuse me. Excuse me, had a little tickle in my throat. Every child can learn. This is important. This might be something that you would incorporate into your educational philosophy. And it's not just a great saying on a bumper sticker. Hopefully, as an educator, we believe this, that every child can learn. Maybe not in the same way, not on the same day, another great bumper sticker. But the teacher needs to believe that every child can learn. That's why we're here. Our goal is to make sure that each child that we work with is learning. There needs to be a responsive learning environment as well. So we're responding to the needs of the child. Those needs should be addressed based on where the child is developmentally, best practices. So check out the video. It's about behavioral modification in kids. Check out the link and reflect and see how these concepts tie into the chapter. Think about the strategies that are discussed in the video, what things you already knew, and what new learnings you have after watching the video. We also have reinforcement procedures. This also could be a little bit of a review from Child Development 1. So we have the behavior principles. A is the antecedent. Antecedent, that is what precedes a behavior. So it's kind of like the cause. If the behavior is the effect, it's just the cause or the precursor, the situation leading up to the behavior. And it can be something very, very minor. B is the actual behavior. And C is a consequence that follows a behavior. Okay, so A is the antecedent, precedes the behavior. B is the behavior, and C is the consequence that follows the behavior. So let's think of an example. So let's say a behavior is a child falls out of their chair. That's the behavior. They fall out of their chair in the classroom. The antecedent, or what precedes the behavior, perhaps they were rocking back and forth in their chair. So that would be the antecedent. They're rocking back and forth in their chair. The behavior is they fall out of their chair, and then the consequence that follows the behavior is that they hurt themselves and they begin to cry. Now with the antecedent, we could even go further. Well, why is the child rocking in their chair? Is it a sensory issue? Are they bored? Do they need some sort of break, for example, in the classroom? So whenever there's a behavior that happens in the classroom, it's always important to think about what is the antecedent, what led to the behavior. And that's when you can start looking at ways to resolve or minimize the behavior. Negative reinforcement is strengthening behavior by removing an unpleasant consequence. So I remember in psychology thinking about this and being quite perplexed at first with negative reinforcement. I thought that was telling children, like scolding and telling them something negative. But in fact, it is removing an unpleasant consequence. So these are two examples that helped really kind of bring it home. So think about having a headache. We've all had headaches before. I've suffered from severe headaches for most of my life, unfortunately. And so I have this unpleasant stimulus, this unpleasant experience. I take an aspirin, and if I'm lucky, it removes the headache. So therefore, the aspirin becomes a negative reinforcement. So I'm reinforcing the removal of this negative stimulus. Another example, a student misbehaving. So there's a student misbehaving in class, and the teacher says, "Little Johnny, this behavior is inappropriate. You need to leave the classroom and go to the office." Well, what if little Johnny doesn't like math class? So now little Johnny is starting to learn, well, math class is my negative stimulus. I don't like being here. So if I misbehave, then I get to be removed from the classroom. So the removal from the classroom is the negative reinforcement. So little Johnny's going to continue to misbehave because they don't like being in math class. And so the removal from the class is a negative reinforcement. So hopefully that helps. That helps clarify it a bit. We also have intrinsic reinforcement, intrinsic thinking about inside. So these are feelings of accomplishment from completing a task, discovering something new, or solving a problem. And these are feelings that are just within us, has nothing to do with external factors, just the pride that you get when you do something, when you achieve something. Positive reinforcement is a pleasant consequence for doing a behavior, increasing its likelihood. So the more you're getting this positive reinforcement, the more likely you are going to continue. So if you praise little Johnny for sitting nicely in his chair, little Johnny appreciates, he feels good, he is likely to continue sitting up in his chair because he's getting this positive feedback. We also have what's called adult social reinforcement. Children turn to adults to see how to react to behavior. So I'm sure we've all seen little toddler learning to walk. They fall down, and what's one of the first things that they do? That's right, they look around, they look to the adult. If the adult says, "Oh," then what does the child do? They cry because they're mimicking the adult's behavior. But if the adult has minimal reaction, or it's okay, you're okay, let's go, and business as usual, the child's looking to the adult for reinforcement, and they see the adult is not reacting, or it's a minimal kind of neutral reaction, and then they mimic that. They look to see how the adult is reacting. So that's called adult social reinforcement. Behavior principles and practices continue. So here are some teacher behaviors that have a strong impact in children. We have verbal responsiveness, descriptive praise. Instead of just great job, you would say, I really like the way you stack those blocks. I really like the way you gave your friend a hand when he was having a hard time getting his paper out. I really like the way you sat up in your chair nicely. So giving more specific praise. Physical proximity. When you see potentially off-task behavior, you simply get closer. You're standing next to the child. Physical contact, physical assistance, and providing things that children want. Now we're going to talk about something that's also pretty significant with relationship to behavioral principles and practices, and that is natural and logical consequences. So natural consequences occur without teacher intervention. It just happens naturally. Logical consequences are set up by adults as results to a child's behavior. So if you look at the example here, the first one, natural consequences, you see that the child left their bike on the lawn. Now we see the silhouette, the shadow, to indicate that it's been stolen. So that's the natural consequence. If you leave your belongings unattended, a natural consequence can be that they get stolen. A logical consequence, in the second example, let's say that a person tracks mud into the house. Logical consequence, they have to clean up the mud. They have to clean up the mess that they made. So those are an example of a natural consequence or a logical consequence. Another example of a natural consequence, if it's raining outside, you tell your child you need a coat and an umbrella, and they refuse. I don't want to wear a coat. I don't want my umbrella. What's a natural consequence? They're going to get wet, right? Or a child who throws sand in the sandbox to other children. What's a natural consequence? Other children are probably going to avoid them. They're not going to want to play with the aggressor. So those are some examples of natural consequences. All right, so more in detail. Natural consequences are outcomes that happen as a result of behavior that are not planned or controlled. For example, if a student cuts in front of another student in line, the natural consequence may be that the other child won't play with the cutter at recess. A teacher did not plan or control this consequence, but he or she may discuss and help students predict natural consequences to encourage them to see the connection between their choice and what happens to them. Then for logical consequences do not naturally occur as a result of behavior, but are intentionally planned by teachers or administrators or parents at home. Logical consequences are similar to what would happen to an adult in a similar situation. Therefore, teaching students skills that they will need to be successful later on in life. So again, the previous slide, the example with if you make a mess, you track mud on the floor, you would expect an adult to clean it up. Therefore, a logical consequence would be also to have the child clean up their mess. Logical consequences need to be related, respectful, and reasonable. Okay? So think about one more example of each consequence. So on your own, think about an example of a natural consequence and think of an example of a logical consequence. I'll give you a moment to do that. All right, hopefully you thought of two great examples. We're going to continue on. All right, so what happens when we withdraw or withhold reinforcers? We take away a desired object as a result of a behavior. So teachers may also ignore behavior, remove materials that are causing the behavior, or remove the child from the activity. I'm going to repeat those because those are pretty important. Teachers may ignore behavior, especially if it's undesirable negative behavior, because we know from the behaviorist approach, sometimes that can extinguish or eliminate the behavior. Remove materials that are causing the behavior, and then removing the child from the activity. We also have something what's called incompatible behaviors. So two behaviors that counteract each other cannot be present at the same time. So for example, walking and running, as much as we want to try, they cannot occur together. Catching the child being good is another important thing. When the child is good, praise the child, increasing the appropriate behavior. So thinking about ways that we can give recognition when children are on the right track, when they are on task. And I think it's just kind of human nature that the squeaky wheel gets the oil. So it's the child who is off task, who's disruptive, who maybe has behavioral challenges. Those typically are the children who get the most attention from teachers. And I think sometimes it's attention-seeking behavior, and some children who need attention will seek it however they may get it, even if it's negative attention. So it's important that you try as an educator to give positive reinforcement when children are on task and following instructions, being kind, being considerate, trying really hard, tackling challenges. All of those things deserve praise. Punishment. Punishment stops a behavior for the moment, but it does not cause the behavior to change. So typically with punishment, you'll have only short-term success. Side effects of punishment. The effects are undesirable. If you yell to stop a behavior, then you are modeling yelling, especially if a child is yelling and you say, "Be quiet, stop yelling." It's kind of counterintuitive, right? You're modeling yelling to get the child to stop yelling. So, or if children are being physical with each other and then you spank or hit them, then it's kind of sending this contradictory message. You're telling me that it's not okay to hit, but you're telling me in a way through hitting. So thinking about the message that you send, I think, is really important with behavior guidance. So if you're modeling yelling, then the children will begin to yell or think that yelling is okay. Also, the text makes an important distinction between discipline and punishment. Punishment stops a behavior for the moment, but nothing is gained. However, discipline guides the children to learn a new response or behavior. So you can offer suggestions. Instead of doing this, next time, what can you try differently? Okay, and giving them an opportunity to practice. Here are some examples of the differences between punishment versus discipline. So I'll give you a moment to read those. All right, moving on. Reminders, redirections, and reprimands. So remind a child of the expected behavior, redirect them to a different behavior, and reprimand with a verbal warning to stop a behavior. Also, sit and watch. A child sits at the edge of the play activity and watches. The child learns a consequence, and the child also learns appropriate play. So children are taking in a lot of different behaviors, both positive and negative, by observing. Timeout. And I know more recent research is definitely less pro timeout as they were maybe 10 years ago. So timeout is used as a last resort. All reinforcement is removed, and children do not learn what to do in timeout. They just learn what not to do. So if you are going to use a timeout, and I'm thinking Super Nanny, I used to love watching Super Nanny years ago. She would always make sure that she got on the child's eye level and she would have a conversation with them. She called it the naughty stool instead of timeout. But why were they there, and what sort of behavior was expected of them next time? So if you are going to use timeout, make sure that there is a learning conversation that occurs. So what are some alternatives to timeout? Here is a nice list of alternatives for timeout for children 1 to 6 years. And some examples, I'll read a few. Take a 5-minute break together, give them a second chance, problem solve together, ask questions, read a story together, use puppets to explain, etc. So what are some other examples that you can think of that would be productive alternatives to timeout. So take a moment to think about some alternatives. All right, moving on to the next one, step-by-step learning. Task analysis is breaking down a task into small steps that can be rewarded upon accomplishment. Builds confidence in the child to be independent. So the video shows you an example of what this might look like. So take a moment, think about what your thoughts are about breaking down tasks and building confidence in the child to be independent. And then after watching the video, think about how you elaborated on your learning. What new information did you receive after watching the video? Also, observation and task analysis. Teacher observes a child doing a task. The teacher sees when the child needs help. The teacher breaks the task down into small steps for the child. And the teacher rewards the child for success at each step. Prompting, fading, and cueing. This is also a part of step-by-step learning. Physical and verbal prompts help the child. Fading is the removing of prompts as a child becomes competent. Some prompts may be physical, and you guide the child through the steps to be independent. The amount of timing of reinforcement. The amount varies from child to child, so get to know your children in your classroom. It needs to be enough to change the behavior, but not so much that the child expects it. Timing needs to be close to the behavior so that the child knows what is being rewarded. Praise. Praise should be real, so it needs to be genuine and authentic and descriptive. Avoid using good boy or well done. Tell the child what was good and what was well. Phrase it so that the child feels good about himself or herself, not just about pleasing others. And if you tie in the ideas from growth mindset, if you're familiar with growth mindset and Carol Dweck, it's important to praise their process and not just the outcome. So you wouldn't just say, oh, that was a great paper that you wrote or a great painting. You would more so praise, wow, I really like the way you thought about how to mix those colors. I really like the way that you thought of 2 different ways to combine those numbers. So instead of just praising the outcome, you're praising the process. So then children are going to be more inclined to think about working through challenges and different approaches to solving problems versus just the outcome. Shaping. Reinforcement for an approximation of the behavior. So even if it's something close to the desired behavior, but not quite, but you see that the child is making strides to approximate that behavior, meaning get close to, that should be reinforced as well. Shaping occurs naturally when a child is developing language. So if a child is going, ma, 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 and the caregiver is very thrilled and is repeating back, ma, 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 and then the child is gonna, you're reinforcing, you're shaping that behavior. Ma, 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 ma. So we do this a lot with my son Colson, who currently is nonverbal. Even if he makes what is kind of an indiscernible sound in speech therapy, they'll take whatever babbling sound that is. If it sounds close to a real word, they will repeat the real word, and then they'll continue to have a conversation with him as though he said that real word. So it helps to shape that behavior. So if my son says, ga, 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 we might say, Coco? Are you saying Coco? Yes, your name is Coco. Even though he's saying ga, 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 it's not, it's an approximation of Coco. So you would then say, Coco, that's right, your name is Coco. So that would be an example of shaping. And it can be very systematic as children are learning skills. All right, so this slide does not necessarily apply to you with the activity, but I want you to think about it. So decide on a common everyday task, such as making toast, washing hands, or folding a jacket. With a partner, this is what we would be doing in the classroom setting, face-to-face. You would do a task analysis of your assigned job and present a formalized sequence to the class. The presentation should include target behavior and starting point, which behaviors will be reinforced at various steps, what kind of prompts and cues might be needed, and how assistance will be reduced so as to increase independence. So even though hypothetically you're not doing this activity in a classroom setting face to face, it would be great if you took a moment and thought about, how would I respond to this task? So it's optional, but I strongly encourage you to do it. I think would be good practice and a great way to apply the information that we've covered. It's a lot of information in this chapter, I know. Learning by imitation. Children learn by watching, as we know. Things that we maybe don't want them to learn, but they learn everything, just like they soak it up like sponges. I'm sure you've heard that saying. They model the behavior that they see. They learn through the television, their peers, their parents, and other caregivers. Do as I say, not as I do is ineffective teaching. Sorry, guys. I'm guilty of that one too, but we have to be more conscientious about what sort of examples we're modeling to children. Competition is inappropriate. Comparing children's progress to another child does not improve development, at least not long term. I know in some cases doing competition with different groups seems to be very motivating, and I'm sure some research would support it. But for our special populations, we want to make sure that we are not comparing their development to another child. Children should be compared to their own earlier learning. So an even more effective thing would be to say, wow, look, this is what you did. This is how you made the letter A last month. And now look at how you're creating the letter A. You've really worked hard. You've really improved. So instead of comparing them to other children, you're comparing the child to his or herself in earlier stages of their development. Children then compete to better themselves rather than to beat someone else. So we've covered a lot in this chapter. So let's go back and revisit our objective. So hopefully, now that you've read the chapter, you are now able to provide examples of changes in children's behavior that are a result of teachers learning how to blend both developmental and behavioral principles. Define a behavioral approach to early intervention, including use of reinforcement. Describe the difference between discipline and punishment. Explain step-by-step learning and the use of task analysis and how they are important when working with children in general and with children with developmental problems in particular. And provide examples of learning by imitation and explain its significance in early childhood education. So thank you for watching. Hopefully you've expanded your learning, and we will see you next time. Thanks so much.